So we have a slightly different masterclass this time. We are doing it with Caitlin, who has been with us for 4 years, and we're very lucky to have her as part of our team. She is moving off to brighter places. Maybe not brighter, but new opportunities for yourself. But before Caitlin left, I really wanted to do a class on cultural awareness. Because I think it's such an important thing, and it's an area that Caitlin has really championed for us and to work with our clients. So I thought we'd just spend the class this time talking through what that means. Don't worry, it's not a completely woke class that we've got with it, but it is hopefully giving you a different perspective of looking at how you maybe manage some of the cultural diversity that you may have within the team. And we're not saying it's just Aboriginal either, are we? That may be any, well, they call it Aboriginal, don't they? Or
well, any Indigenous
culture.
Anyone from an Indigenous culture worldwide.
That this does apply for. And we're actually basing it on a study. Where did the study come from, Caitlin?
It's based in from a university or college in America, I think, that first published this information and guide. So it is based on a First Nations Americans lens. But when I had a read through the information, I thought this actually applies, I think, can apply across the board to various traditional Indigenous cultures around the world. And some of it will and some of it won't, but it's just an opportunity if you go through these different, look through things through these different lenses. It allows you to, with the organisation that you might be working with and the people you might be working with, ask those questions, have those conversations around, well, what does our organisation do? What do our Indigenous cultures that we work with, how do they like to operate, prefer to operate? How can we better engage with them?
I think it's similar in some ways, and I talk about this in a lot of the classes, as our social styles. So how an analytical looks at something and problem solves compared to how a driver, expressive and amiable person, there's no right or wrong with it, there's no better way, but it's just a different lens in which we look at problems, communication, making decisions, etc. So this is really looking at from a cultural perspective, which can be really helpful to help us understand our workplace better. So just starting from the top, so first of all, talking about values. So talking about a value from a Western culture compared to an Indigenous culture. Talk me through what you think the differences are.
Yeah, so one of the main differences, and I do find this a lot of the time across various Indigenous cultures around the world, is that they value community first and foremost within an Indigenous culture. Whereas with a Westernised non-Indigenous culture, it's an individualised lens that we're looking through, and often when you think also about family, it's a nuclear lens rather than through an Indigenous lens. It's community is always really important. It has a different everything you do, everything in Indigenous communities can be looked through that community lens rather than that individual lens. So
yeah, and I guess talking about that community, looking at from a values perspective, just trying to bring it into context from our work. So I would see that as if I have to get to time because it's important for me and it's important for my credibility at work and the expectations, therefore I will prioritise that, even if my community, my family, my grandparents, my children, etc. need something else, or they need me to stay home or to look after them or to drop them off somewhere or to listen to them if they're feeling sad. One of the more Indigenous approach would be they would value the staying and looking after the community, and they'd put that ahead of them getting to work and getting into trouble. Whereas, or having a black mark against their name because they haven't turned up to work. Whereas in Western culture, we would go, I've really got to get to work. That's really important. So, is that a good example?
Yeah, that's a good example. And I think also the difference is that they're looking through a lens, thinking about that community, putting that community first, rather than that lens of that individual.
These are my needs, this is community sense. Yeah.
So,
Okay, next one was really interesting. It's about tents, how we live and what sort of tents do we live in. So talk us through that.
Yeah, so this one is about, oftentimes Western cultures live in a present tense, so it's all about, in work context, we're all about what we're doing today, getting things done with what's happening today on the ground. Indigenous cultures are often looking through a future lens, and we hear this a lot, even just in Australia, when we're talking about future generations, making sure, whatever the community is doing is keeping in mind how it's going to affect future generations. So decisions are made looking at the future, long term.
Yeah. Whereas now near immediate is more Western. That's really similar to the Chinese culture as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like they will make decisions, and the Japanese culture to some extent, I think, as well. Where they're really looking at the long term rather than the here and the now with the impact. Next one's interesting. The way we understand the world.
Yeah. So this one's just about, oftentimes Western culture, it's viewing things scientifically, whereas in Indigenous cultures, we view things through mythology a lot of the time, mythically as well. So, but having said that, I would say that I believe that mythology is actually rooted in science and real history. So I believe that a lot of the mythology that has been passed down is actual events that may have happened, translated in a way to ensure that that story can be passed down.
It's put into storylines.
Put into storylines, yeah, to hold that knowledge there. So, so whenever I hear something's a myth, I'm always thinking it's probably rooted in truth somewhere in the past about something that actually happens.
Yeah, it could be some twists and turns with it. But we're very much scientific, show me, demonstrate, whereas they look bigger picture and a little bit more spiritual.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's definitely that connection. A lot of Indigenous people feel directly through their bodies into the country, and that I'm not sure. I don't know if you have that experience. I have that experience as a Papua New Guinean, that when I'm on Papua New Guinean country or when I'm in my village, I feel a spiritual connection that runs through my body into that ground, because it's like that ancestral history there. My body knows that I'm home, and which can be something that if you haven't had that experience, it doesn't resonate at all. So that's why oftentimes there's decisions that we're making as well as Indigenous people relating to caring for country and things like that is vitally important. The connection we have not just to the land but to the seas and the skies
and just some of that traditional respect to elders, for example, is very much intertwined, isn't it?
Yeah.
Into that mythological side.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. This is completely where I'm Western and you're traditional. Talking about goals.
Yeah. So Western culture, oftentimes it's aggressive effort that you're pushing to get to the
Don't die. Get the result.
Whereas oftentimes with Indigenous cultures, it's about being patient, patiently moving towards the best outcome for the community as a whole.
I find this really interesting when you're working with in workplaces sometimes where you have Indigenous staff and they've got goals and they'll be working along towards them and they've got patience and they're quite happy with making incremental progress towards it, and it may stagnate for a while and you move forward. And then you've got a driving manager with it who's like, oh my gosh, you need a plan, we need to move, we need to make a decision on it. A very, very different way. There's not a lot of patience. And there's pros and cons for both if we drilled into it.
Yes. And I think you just need to be mindful. If you're mindful of this, then you have a different approach to how you then get people to, with whichever side you're on, to get to the outcomes you want. So
yeah, exactly.
A lot of these things, it's just, and talking through these things now, it's just about having that awareness and to be able to think about, okay, how can I just adjust my behaviour maybe to better get the outcome that I want from the method that I want to get it, or looking through their lens of how they will feel like something's being achieved.
Excellent. So this one is about ownership or reward?
Yeah, so this one, in Indigenous cultures, ownership is often communal. So when we're looking in the context of our workplaces and things in Australia, there's a couple of examples I could give with that. Whereas on the flip side, you'd have ownership as reward for hard work. So again, it's more of a communal lens versus an individual lens. So if I work hard for something that I receive, I own that, that's mine as an individual. Whereas with Indigenous cultures, if you work hard for something, you receive a reward for that. It's a communal thing that we share, and sometimes that can be with even just your paycheck, that it comes in and you share it amongst all your family, which can be really difficult navigating and balancing between our Western world here, and sometimes we'll have clients that have this problem, is that people run out their employees, the paycheck spent by the end of the fortnight, because it goes to family. So it's a really, it's not right or wrong, and it's just a thing that is, can sometimes be viewed by, if you're in the Indigenous culture, if you then are going out on your own and you're not sharing what your rewards with your community, that can cause a lot of tension as well, and you can be seen to be separating yourself from the community.
Yeah, and I've seen this happen where it's been really stressful for some people that have been getting their wages, and there's just so much pressure from the community to share their wage, and there's an expectation that it gets around everyone. It's going to be they're going to be able to give to everyone and provide for everyone, and sometimes they just walk away because it's too hard. I also think it's quite interesting from an Indigenous point of view that the way they see that Western culture can be quite I orientated, and not sharing this can come across as being maybe quite selfish, or just doesn't sit comfortably for them. They're very much into that whole team and collaboration side of things, aren't they? Rather than the individual, the aggressive side.
And that's why, like the first point that we talked about, when we hear through all of these things, you'll feel it's all linked to that community lens versus that individual lens.
Yeah, definitely. And so, reward and recognition in an Indigenous workplace is going to work really well, where it's something that's really shared between everyone, rather than the one employee of the month prize that will go to one person only. So just something to have a bit of a think about. Gifts. What are gifts from our Western culture compared to an Indigenous culture?
Yeah, so this one I feel like people might argue is a little bit blurry either way. So with this particular resource, it talks about gifts in Western culture being something that is generally only given in holiday times, Christmas, birthdays, special events and things like that. With Indigenous cultures, they're viewed as a social glue. So with lots of different circumstances you might be in, gifts are an important part of maintaining strong relationships with people. I think, in a Western way, I could say, well, we do this, you go to someone's house, you never go empty-handed, always bring something, if you're going over for a meal or something, and that's not a special Christmas event or anything like that. But with Indigenous cultures, for any time that you're inviting people for something, gifts are often part of that as a sign of respect.
Excellent. So work motivation, talk me through that.
So again, work in Indigenous culture is often motivated by the group need. So whereas in Western culture it's motivated by ambition. And again, when I think of that, I think of that individual ambition to progress yourself, rather than, if you want to work effectively with Indigenous people, it is a good idea to try and frame what you're wanting to do to move forward through that group need lens. And also I think that people might not want to do an activity if it only has a benefit for one person. They want to know, why are we doing this and how is this benefiting everybody in the community? Or even with that decision making, they're going to look through that lens. So and what they might prioritise, the things that are going to benefit the whole rather than an individual.
And I'm even thinking, if we're putting how does this relate to workplaces? So if you were maybe setting some performance goals or standards or something like that for a staff member who was Indigenous, just getting goals that's going to be of benefit for that individual person is potentially not going to be as effective as coming up with goals that the result's going to benefit the whole team or the community or more than one person.
I think you could still do it with looking at how a goal might benefit an individual person, as long as you apply how that the benefit to them will benefit the whole. And so it's just another way, just to be mindful of that and to think about or how you communicate what that benefit is. That this is a great goal for you because this will mean that you will be able to do this, this, and this for your community. So it's always linking it back to the group benefit as well.
And with these, I think there's benefits on both sides and pros and cons, but I just can't see the benefit of the Western way of looking at ageing compared to the Indigenous way of looking at ageing.
It's a bit sad, but I feel like it's so true as well. Coming up from my experience, I feel it's true. So in traditional Western culture, oftentimes ageing is just seen as decay and loss, whereas in Indigenous culture, it's wisdom and it's highly respected. So
whereas in our culture, it's burden, decay, health issues, like kind of very negative fear around it. Where it's very different in an Indigenous culture, isn't it? And that's really interesting when you have younger people with older people reporting through to them and having to discipline or manage or motivate. They can find that really challenging because it could be perceived by them as being disrespectful because that is my elder and somewhat older. So
definitely if you have a younger person in a higher responsibility level within an organisational structure, asking their older people to do things.
And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't or we can't, but we may want to have some sensitivity or just talk to the staff member about that and how they feel and how they're going to go. Give them some support around it, because if you are managing even people, even if they are older than you, you do have to.
I think a lot of it also comes back to being clear on what the workplace culture that you have is and what you're going to do. Some organisations I've worked with, some Indigenous organisations I've worked with have made it clear from the beginning and at all levels of engaging someone within the organisation that, especially when they're working very closely with all of their relatives, and there are different, not just age hierarchies, but also different respect and roles that people play within the communities, is to have that clear define what it is and how you actually operate within the workplace. So when you're coming in, you're wearing the uniform, this is the model that we're going to do. So you will be potentially working with your elders and giving them orders, and that might not feel culturally respectful or right, but when you're wearing our uniform, this is what we're doing. When the uniform comes off, then you're operating under that cultural model. But I think it can be really effective to just be really clear about how you're going to engage, because otherwise it gets very difficult to manage people and performers.
Eye contact.
So eye contact in Indigenous cultures can often be seen as over-assertive, and again, being assertive is something that's linked to that being individual and like putting yourself forward, whereas in Western culture, it's a very natural part of conversations that you have with people.
And it feels quite uncomfortable actually when you've got people that won't have good eye contact with you, and dare I say that might feel that they're a bit dodgy.
So from both, it's interesting because from a Western side, you might be thinking they're being disrespectful, not making eye contact with me. But from their side, they're actually being respectful, not making eye contact with you. So it's good with any of these things too. My rule of thumb is just ask questions if you need to, just to clarify that of what's appropriate behaviour. Whenever you're going into any different community as well, or working with different people, because it does change from community to community, so it's never a one size fits all. Sometimes you'll find people that there's no problem with eye contact. Other times it is really seen as disrespectful to make direct eye contact.
Yeah. Silences. This is another interesting one. Yeah, I like this one.
Yeah. So oftentimes in Western culture, silences can be seen as a waste of time. We're always eager to fill the silent spaces. Nobody's talking in the room. Got to say something. Keep it going. Whereas in Indigenous cultures, silences are very much welcome and acceptable at any time. So it's a really good practice actually. If you're in a room with people who are being silent, just practicing being silent, not having to fill that space. I'm not always needing to be the centre of attention, being that assertive Western,
You're much better at that than I am. But it's something that I do really practice, particularly, I try to be really mindful of it, because otherwise we just come out with this verbal diarrhea and we fill all the silences up, and I don't think you always get a good outcome. Particularly if you're going through and you're doing an interview with someone who's Indigenous, or you're doing a performance review, or you're wanting their feedback, or you're trying to make a decision. If you don't allow that silence, you're not necessarily going to get the best outcome.
Yeah, and sometimes people just have a different pace, so they might be getting to what you're going to ask next, but you just need to allow that space for them to get there. And I often just test myself out too, doing things like this, of just actually not speaking when there's a big group setting, just waiting to see if what I'm thinking and wanting to share, someone else will share. Not because I'm trying to avoid it, but just because I'm thinking, depending on my role within that group that I might be in, I don't need to be the one being the centre. I'm happy to facilitate, I'm happy to add in things where I feel like it might be useful. If I'm not hearing what I think needs to be discussed, then I'll add that in. But oftentimes it's amazing, since I've been practicing this, it's amazing how often the conversation will get there without me needing to jump in and direct anything like that. So
assertiveness.
Yes, so assertiveness.
We value assertiveness in the Western culture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting, and I feel like when you're navigating between Indigenous culture and a Western culture, but as an Indigenous person, being assertive can get you so many more opportunities just because of that, because it's so valued in a Western culture. But in Indigenous culture, it's something that's viewed as something that's non-communal. Again, you're wanting to stand out from everybody else, whereas if you're wanting to, it's more respectable in an Indigenous culture to be part of the whole, not that one saying, look at me, I'm great, I'm doing this, it's we're doing this, look what we've achieved together kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember we facilitated a meeting once in the group. It was with an Indigenous group, and they needed to make a decision, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about it. So I was like, pace, come on. Let's make a vote now. Hands up, and Caitlin's pulling me aside and going, that is not appropriate, Phoebe. And I'm like, but we can't talk about it anymore. They need to make a decision. And you were like, no, you just need to leave them and give them time, and they will come to a decision. Because otherwise, I may force them to vote, but they won't follow through. They'll just go through emotion, but they won't support it.
Yeah. That's one of the things.
Decisions.
Yeah, that's another thing that's on the list in a little bit, but it's about that collective decisions are made consensually. So rather than in a Western culture, you put something to a vote, majority vote rules. Sometimes this is adopted now with different Indigenous corporations, but ultimately what I find is you will get better outcomes if you go through that consultative process, that you are providing all the information so that everyone in the room who's making a decision is able to make an informed decision for the benefit of everybody. And so generally, if you end up doing a majority vote and you've got, you know, eight votes yes, 3 votes no, the 3 votes no are still not going to be happy. They're going to leave that meeting, going out into the community, talking about why they're not happy about this. So arriving at a consensual where everybody agrees, working through what people aren't agreeing or not understanding to better understand and to get to a place where everybody's in agreement with the decision that they're going to make moving forward. It may take longer in the beginning in that process, but long term it's going to be something that will have better outcomes. Because
you've taught us such good patience, Caitlin. Next one is communication and listening skills. So
yeah, so often in Western culture communication is prized, and again that's about being more assertive, how you communicate what it is that you wanted to say.
Think on your feet, be able to talk, verbal and written.
Yeah. Whereas in Indigenous cultures, often it's about listening, and we'll be wanting to know how well you've listened to what we are saying when we're having conversations, especially when it comes to decision making in a bigger scale. Not to get too political, but oftentimes this is the problem when different governments are making decisions for Indigenous people, but haven't actually listened to what it is that they're needing. Or the approach that they're wanting and things like that. So listening is really important.
yeah, definitely. This one just fascinates me. So infinite emphasis carries the day, compared to soft spoken words carry further.
Have you ever been in a situation? I feel like I notice this a lot with Melanesian people from Papua New Guinea or the other Melanesian islands or Pacific Islanders, mostly Melanesians that I would say, are softly spoken. And the softer they speak, the more the whole room quiets because everyone's calming to listen to what they're saying. So oftentimes in some of these Indigenous cultures, being softly spoken can actually be more effective, carry further the points you wanted to get across, rather than coming in, being really loud, being assertive, being, dominating a conversation. Have you ever had that experience?
Yeah, absolutely.
People talk when they just calm their voice and start talking quietly, then you find everybody's hearing and starts tuning in because they're trying to.
I have had a few meetings like that, and there's been an Indigenous person who, for all intents and purposes, look like they're sleeping in the room, really. Like they're very quiet and their head's down, but they're not looking at anyone and they don't seem to be engaged. And then at the end of the day, they'll just come out with these pearlers. I'm like, and it's really hard from a Western perspective not to think, why did you not engage and bring everyone earlier with this? Like, you obviously get it, you understand, you're paying attention, and yet you waited all this time.
It might be like I was saying, that combination of just waiting, listening to see if it comes up. To see if they get to it without you having to contribute.
I have a lot to learn. There's no doubt there. I think this happens all the time with a lot of Indigenous and other cultures as well. Nodding signifies agreement. Yep, I agree. I do this. I understand. What does nodding signal in Indigenous?
Is in Western culture often if you know, a nod is yes and a shake
I agree.
Is I agree. I disagree. In Indigenous cultures, sometimes the nod just means I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with what you're saying.
Or I hear you.
Yeah. So you need to also, it's a good idea to be very clear on if someone's just giving you a non-verbal response, just to clarify, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you agree with what I'm saying? Before you go ahead and say, yeah, everybody in the room was nodding. So they all wanted to do this,
But they may just
they were just saying, I know what you're saying, but I do not agree with what you're saying.
Handshakes. We value firm and assertive handshakes, a little bit like voice, isn't it?
Yeah, and often, when people, and I find this one really interesting, and this is a difference between that I find in my culture and Papua New Guinea culture. Handshakes are really important, and we generally give quite firm handshakes as well. In some other Indigenous cultures, being firm is actually then being more assertive. So they'll give you a soft handshake because it's non-threatening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a sign of respect to give a soft handshake saying,
Coming on common ground and
Yeah.
respectful side of things. Yeah. We talked before about the collective decisions for a vote.
Yeah.
Whereas we like have a vote, whereas in Indigenous it's talk, think, take time. The next one's quite an interesting one. In the Western society, a faith in science and control of nature, we take a very scientific approach.
Yeah.
And this is quite different from the Indigenous,
And
traditional Indigenous way.
Yeah, and that too, I think, not just scientific, but I think what's key in there is that control of nature. So in Indigenous cultures, it's about having faith and harmony in nature, that nature knows what it's doing, that we're there to further assist that process, but not control and disrupt it. So, you know, a lot of what Indigenous cultures do is all about that sustainable practice to manage different things when it comes to nature, rather than forcing it to do what we want it to do because, you know, there are all these trees in the way, I've got to cut them down because I want to build this there, you know, or whatever it might be.
There's a lot more of a spiritual
Yeah.
lens from an Indigenous perspective.
Yeah, and that too, just that respect for the power of nature, which, you know, we all experience the power of nature living up here too, and far north Queensland with our cyclones and things like that. But, you know, all these things, just having that respect for nature and working in harmony with it rather than forcing it to our will.
And I think this is really sad. I think we're doing more and more just the way we look at family connections. So Western side, very nuclear family.
Yeah, and I had somebody ask me the other day actually, what does that mean by nuclear family? So that's really just your immediate family, so your partner, your children, pretty much.
And some extent, you know, people, it's not grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas in Indigenous culture, your aunties, your uncles are your mothers and your fathers, your cousins are all your brothers and sisters, so it's very much extended family.
I've even seen it in some cultures where you have Indigenous people meeting each other and they'll keep talking until they can find out some sort of connection, family connection.
Oh yeah.
Keep going.
Oh, that's a definite thing
And there's a real sense of we can have a relationship now because we've worked out that there's some sort of aunties or uncles, or my father came from your parents' land or visited, or you know, something like that. That's really important for that establishing a relationship and the trust, I think. Isn't it?
Definitely. It's a really good way, just in any sort of engagement, to just ask those questions or share information about yourself. That's another thing that I heard recently. I thought it was really interesting. The importance of also, it's great that you can be curious about somebody's culture and ask them lots of questions, but it's also good to be mindful of how much information you're sharing about yourself and to keep that balanced. So don't just go in and interrogate them with all these questions. You might be thinking, oh, I'm showing interest in their culture, which is good, but make sure that you're balancing that with sharing information about yourself as well.
Praise and recognition.
Yeah, so in this one, I think we mentioned a little bit about this before, that, you know, Western culture, individual praise, everybody's happy with that, being individually focused, whereas Indigenous cultures, it's often about that group praise. So again, like, look at what we've achieved together. I look at, you know, talking about that communal lens in a sense more so. So and even if you're a part, it's more so looking at you're a part of this whole rather than
me.
Yeah.
So now I've got a couple of rapid fire questions to ask you. Put you on the spot because you're prepared for them, but I know that you'll have an opinion. So if we're doing some training or addressing or talking to, should we always do a acknowledgement of country or welcome to country or something? But what when you do you navigate that?
Well, you wouldn't be able to do a welcome to country because
it's not my country.
It's not your country. But definitely doing an acknowledgement to country, I think, is respectful. I'll generally ask if I'm at a meeting, is this something that is that you would like me to do? Like, is it a normal practice to do this at this type of meeting? It will depend on the meeting as well, I think. But I always think it's a great way to show respect. And also, if you can find out what the actual, who the actual people are that you're paying your respects to, and use their name, and which can be daunting, I know, with a lot of these traditional language words and names that are hard to pronounce. But I still think that, in my opinion, it's showing that you're, paying your respect. And the other thing with, if you are nervous about how to pronounce something.
Well, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Is how do I deal with Indigenous names that I find challenging to pronounce?
So I always ask as well. I'll practice. I have a few little tips about how to read. Here in Australia, anyway, how to read language words, and I don't always get it right. But as a general rule, the vowel sounds are a short vowel sound. So if you have a single vowel, it's going to be a e, I, o, u sound for a, e, I, o, u. If it's a long vowel sound, they'll repeat the vowel. So if you have a double A, it's going to be a longer A sound rather than an sound. Sometimes, not all the time. And also keeping in mind, sometimes K's, especially up in this part of the country, can be more of a guttural C sound. You've got the NG sound, which is a very difficult sound for me to pronounce, but it's like a you have to close the back of your throat up and do a sound. When you have that combination, it's not a ng sound, it's just the sound. So it's having some of those tricks, and then I usually will actually just write it down in a way that I know. It's like going back to primary school, and I'll just phonetically sound it out for myself and put a dash between, the sounds that I need to pronounce, or how, the way that I hear it. But I'll usually go in and firstly I'll have a practice, and then I'll ask there before a meeting or something, how do you actually pronounce the name? Can you say it for me a few times so I can hear it? I repeat back, and I write it down like I think I hear it, to help me pronounce it the way I would potentially spell it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just also like to add, though, I feel like it is a huge sign of respect. For me, it's a big sign of respect to make the effort to try and get it right.
It's interesting that you say that, because when I've spoken to elders before, and I've said, how do I say it? I'm embarrassed. And they're always happy for you to try, and they laugh and they try and do it. Actually, I was talking to someone the other day, and I said the name, and they're like, you've always got it. So it's been taking like 3 years, but I'm almost there. I can almost say it without being corrected. So I think, not to feel shame, or not to feel about it. That does also bring me something that we sort of didn't address this, but I think is really appropriate, is to the whole thing of shame around doing something wrong or incorrect, and how do you manage that from performance management at work if you've got Indigenous staff, and making putting in some sort of performance management plan, or addressing issues, but not bringing shame, and just having them say, oh, I'm just not going to turn up to work.
Yeah, I know, it can be really tricky. But again, I just feel like it comes down to spending time to inquire, ask questions, and find out about, improve your understanding of that person, so that you can relate to them better. So where you've built that understanding, made those connections and that trust, it's always, you're always going to benefit from that. So it's one thing to say, this isn't no shame here, let's just talk. But it's nothing to know what people are feeling and the shame that they might be feeling with it. Ideally, you want to have built a good relationship to understand a little bit more about them, so that you can communicate more effectively with them when it does come to having difficult conversations as well.
And what are your thoughts if you're employing someone who is Indigenous, and giving them job opportunities, but you are aware that they don't come from a community or a family where there's a long history of people going to work and suddenly you put them into full-time work, like how, I guess I'm trying to load you with the answer with that, so maybe I'll answer my own question. I guess what I have sometimes seen is organisations wanting to do the right thing and giving an opportunity to an Indigenous person, which is great, and they are a really good fit for the role, there's no question, but they have no role model or no experience of turning up to work 5 days a week, you know, doing 38 hours a week. You know, there's a lot more fluid. The house that they live in can be quite fluid with coming and goings and activities and community events and things like that, and they really struggle with it. Is that reasonable to say? And sometimes I think you just need to maybe just start things off slowly and kind of, if you go for a sprint suddenly, you're going to be exhausted. It might be exciting, it might work for a while, but then you fall over. And I just think sometimes you just need to...
Yeah, I think it's just, again, like having those open conversations with people and providing, like if it's a situation, there's nobody that's had this really secure full-time position and it's going to...
long-term unemployed. And suddenly going into full-time work.
I think that if you really want them to be successful in the role, you will think about the different ways that you can support them to be successful in the role. Obviously, you don't, there's still a boundary between personal and professional to a degree, but there's so many things that you can do to provide that supportive framework, to have those conversations, to build that trust, to provide flexibility if there needs to be, or to maybe talk about not starting in a full-time role and seeing how they go, and it's just, like it will just depend case by case, I think, but I also think that having that open communication.
Yeah, I think just being open to it, definitely to kind of get them to the point where they're.
And it can be tricky, I think, at the beginning too, if you haven't had the time and opportunity to build that rapport with them initially. They are going to feel a lot of pressure to succeed or feel a lot of pressure that they might fail in this. So just reiterating, we're here we want you to be successful in your role. What is it that we can do to support this? What's happening? Other things that we should be aware of, that we can better design this to support your needs and make you successful. But I guess it depends also on the organisation. I think it's unfair to put the same demands on every employee, our same expectations. I think generally across the board, you'll have your standard, expectations, but successful workplaces are the ones that adapt to
flexible and
adapt to the individual need of the employee too.
Yeah, no, I definitely would agree with that. And how about if you're dealing with people with low literacy levels?
So, this is just, to me, it's a question of inclusivity. So, if you are wanting to include people with low literacy levels, you need to design all the documentation and things in the workplace so that they can actually understand what it is that they're saying.
Common sense.
A lot of these things are a little bit common sense, but because we operate in a certain way and we have these expectations that, okay, you're coming in, we're giving you a role, you fit this, it's kind of almost an old-fashioned way of how we operate, and we still do that a lot in the Western culture. Those expectations of coming into work and how we operate. Some people might be like, oh, we're too relaxed, or we negotiate too much with people now, or whatever. But ultimately, I just feel like it makes for better teams because you are actually caring about each other. But yeah, with the being inclusive, like if you know, especially also if you know they have low literacy and you provide them with a document to sign that is full of jargon that they won't understand, like there's a problem with that, and it's not their low literacy that's the problem.
I think that's a really good point, actually. And I think, one of the big things that we've all learned from you, Kate, we've learned many things from you, but in particular is about the patience and the big picture, and I think about the lateral problem solving with it. So I think sometimes in the Western we're like, this is the issue, we need to make a decision, we need to move on it, we need to get a result, and I think there's a lot to learn from a cultural perspective. Stand back, take a breath. How else could we look at this? And having said that, I do think, and I know you are quite strict with it too, about setting expectations, setting boundaries, holding accountability. Like, you're very big on that. You're like, not, I think sometimes we get a bit nervous and go, oh, you know, that could be culturally inappropriate, or they're Indigenous, we don't like to say or don't like to deal with. And you're like, no, this was a job, this is what they're getting paid, and these are what the requirements are, and you know, we need to hold them accountable. And I think that's important.
It is definitely, but I also would say that you have to make sure you're communicating that effectively. So there's a difference between whether or not you think you're communicating it and whether or not the person receiving the information thinks you've communicated it effectively, and I think that's the difference too with the lens.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So if they're not understanding what you're saying, even though you think you've made it perfectly clear, so just having all those things in mind too. You said something else, and then I was going to say something too, now I forget. Anyway, maybe it'll come up.
Well, thank you so much. That was so good. We've learnt so much from you, and we only wish you the very, very best, and expect you to come back to see us as well.
Oh, yes, I will be.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and certainly if anyone has got Indigenous staff and are looking at diversity in the workplace, and it's not only Aboriginal Indigenous staff, this could be any nationality, I really encourage you to think laterally and not just think they're the problem and they need to do this or they don't fit with us, but actually stand back and consider how can you improve the communication, the relationship, the ownership, the getting them to their milestones that they need to get to within the role, the productivity within their role.
I just thought of the thing that I was going to say. I find that in my role, I think even that as a consultant, it's easier to be able to separate the decision making, because ultimately it's not my decision to make when I'm advising a client on something. My role is to provide them with as much information as possible so that they can make that informed decision for the organisation. So that's where I am able to separate myself and have more patience, because it's up to them and they're going to make that decision at that time. They're going to make the decision. But it also, the other thing is that we often can be quite, in the Western culture, can be quite patronising in the way that we engage with people. So again, just what you're saying at the end there, don't make assumptions. Allow people the authority to make decisions for themselves.
Just like you were being completely patronising.
No, just in that, with those boundaries and things like, and being aware of that too, and it's okay to have the boundaries that you need within the workplace and being clear on those. But the reason why, like how I try to, and I'm guilty of being patronising, I'm sure, from time to time, is that ultimately you want them to make those decisions for themselves. So, and you do what you can to help people get to the get to the place where you want them to be, but you can't force people to do that in any way. So it's that separation of allowing people their own authority to make decisions.
You
for
want them
themselves.
to genuinely take on board.
So self-determination sort of stuff as well.
Yeah.
So that's really important too.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much.
And thank you, thank you so much. It's been an amazing time being at HR Dynamics, and I've learned so much from you all as well. So and I appreciate all the clients as well, and I wish all your businesses the best.
Oh, thanks, Caitlin.